In the official account, the 19th century was an age of radical transformation. Populations surged, cities expanded outward from riversides and rail depots, and governments, newly consolidated, newly ambitious, turned their attention toward the education of the young. Schools were built, thousands of them. Across continents, across decades, the story goes, society needed schools, and so schools were built. That is the accepted version. Here is where the numbers become interesting. Between 1850 and 1880, the United States constructed somewhere in the range of 150,000 public school buildings. The population of school-aged children at the time, children between 5 and 17, was approximately 11 million. Run that math plainly. One school building for every 73 eligible children. In an era before electric lighting, before standardized heating systems, before modern sanitation, before the internal combustion engine made material transport routine, these were not small wooden rooms nailed together over a weekend. Many of them were monumental, arched entryways, vaulted ceilings, load-bearing stonework that structural engineers today describe, when they bother to look, as substantially over-engineered for the function they were supposedly built to serve. The scale does not quite fit the story we have been told. And that mismatch, patient, quiet, sitting in the architectural record, is where this documentary begins. Before going further, a note on the nature of this investigation. What follows draws on architectural surveys, municipal records, census data, and the documented observations of historians, engineers, and researchers working in the mainstream of their respective fields. Nothing presented here reaches beyond what the evidence supports. The goal is not to arrive at a predetermined conclusion. It is to follow the pattern wherever it leads and sit honestly with what we find. That said, the pattern is striking. Start with a single building. The Central High School of Philadelphia, completed in 1838, was the first public high school in Pennsylvania, and among the earliest in the nation. Its facade, borrowed from neoclassical temple architecture, columns, symmetrical fenestration, pediment that would not have looked out of place on a federal courthouse. It was built to educate. At its founding, fewer than 200 students. 200 students. Building could have been a modest hall. Instead, it was constructed with the ambition of a civic monument. The stonework was precision cut. The interior proportions were formally planned. The structural load capacity, according to later assessments, far exceeded anything required by its stated educational function. Defenders of this style point, reasonably, to civic pride. The early American Republic was self-consciously building its identity in stone libraries, courthouses, post offices, schools, each structure a material argument that democracy was durable and serious. That explanation holds up in isolation. It begins to strain when you realize Philadelphia was not unique. Cincinnati, the Woodward High School of 1851, presented a nearly identical profile. Neoclassical elevation, monumental entry, stone construction significantly heavier than the building's interior use would seem to demand. Detroit, the old Central High, completed in 1858, repeated the pattern. Chicago, St. Louis, Baltimore, city after city, decade after decade, the same architectural grammar appeared. Not similar schools, the same school, not similar proportions. The same proportions, rendered in local stone, adapted to local street grids, but following a formal logic so consistent across geography that it becomes difficult to attribute to independent civic decision-making alone. These were not architects borrowing loosely from a shared aesthetic tradition. The structural choices, wall thickness, foundation depth, ceiling height, load-bearing ratios were nearly interchangeable from one city to the next. Architecture historians call this diffusion. Ideas travel, get copied, become standards. That is true, and it matters. But diffusion usually produces variation, localization, regional interpretation. What the school buildings of the mid-19th century United States produced was something closer to replication. And replication at that speed, across those distances, in a period before telecommunications, before the telegraph had even fully normalized, requires explanation. The scale mismatch compounds when you move from the buildings themselves to their placement in the urban landscape. Repeatedly, in city after city, the schools were built before the surrounding residential density could have justified them. In newly platted neighborhoods on the edges of expanding cities, Large formal school buildings appeared completed, furnished, operational in areas where the number of local school-age children would not fill even a fraction of the available space for another decade. Infrastructure before demand. This is not a subtle phenomenon visible only in retrospect. Contemporary observers noted it. Local newspapers in the 1860s and 1870s occasionally remarked on the apparent overbuilding a school designed for 500 students serving a neighborhood of 40 families, with construction costs that made local taxpayers uncomfortable, even by the standards of the time. The civic pride explanation struggles here. Pride builds to impress existing populations. It does not routinely build ahead of populations that have not arrived yet. There is one more dimension to hold before moving forward, and it sits in the least glamorous corner of the architectural record: the mechanical systems. Several of the grand public schools of the 1850s and 1860s were built with ventilation systems, formal air shaft designs, integrated into the structural plans that would not become standard in American construction until the 1890s. Some had basement infrastructure consistent with central heating distribution across multiple floors. Dim buildings whose official histories credit much later renovations with introducing that capability. The simplest explanation is sloppy record keeping. Original construction records are lost, misattributed, or incomplete, a genuine and common problem in 19th century municipal archives. Later renovations often get documented more carefully than original builds, and in retrospect those renovations become the official origin point for features that may have existed before. But in building after building, the renovation dates cluster suspiciously late relative to the physical evidence. And the physical evidence, the integrated shaft work, the subfloor channels, the foundation tolerances, points to original construction intent, not retrofit adaptation. The timing raises questions that the official record, as it currently stands, does not fully answer. Something was being built in the 19th century. Something coordinated, something monumental, something that exceeded what the moment seemed to require. And the school's patient, civic, apparently unremarkable, may be among the clearest places to see it. What comes into focus in the next layer of this story is not the buildings themselves, but the system they seem to belong to. The schools do not stand alone. That is the first thing to understand before going deeper. Viewed in isolation, a monumental school building in 1855 Philadelphia is an interesting anomaly: civic ambition, architectural fashion, the particular pride of a growing republic expressing itself in stone. Viewed alongside the canal systems, the rail infrastructure, the municipal water networks, and the warehouse complexes built during the same decades, the schools become something else entirely. They become part of a pattern that is harder to explain away. Begin with the Erie Canal. Completed in 1825, the Erie Canal connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie across 363 miles of upstate New York. The engineering was extraordinary for its time, a feat that genuinely required significant technical knowledge, organizational coordination, and sustained capital investment over nearly a decade of construction. What is less frequently discussed is the capacity question. At its opening, the canal's throughput capacity, the volume of goods it could physically move per year, was multiples larger than the existing commercial need in the region it served. Contemporary economists noted this. The merchants who would eventually use the canal were still largely operating on pack roads and river barges. The markets the canal was built to connect were, at the moment of its completion, too small to justify the infrastructure at the scale it was built. Within 15 years, the demand caught up. By 1840, the canal was operating near capacity, and debates about expansion had already begun. This is the infrastructure before demand pattern in its clearest form. And it repeats. The American rail network of the 1840s and 1850s expanded with a speed that contemporary observers found almost disorienting. Between 1840 and 1860, the total track mileage in the United States grew from roughly 2,800 miles to over 30,000. The capital required for this expansion, the iron, the labor, the land acquisition, the engineering, was staggering by any measure. More striking is where much of this track was laid, not between existing population centers, not along established commercial corridors where demand was already proven, into territories, cross regions where settlement was sparse, where the towns the tracks were heading toward were sometimes barely platted, sometimes not yet named. The railroads, in a pattern now well documented by economic historians, were consistently built ahead of the populations they were meant to serve. The standard explanation is speculative development, investors betting on future demand, land values rising along new corridors, the expectation of settlement following infrastructure rather than preceding it. That explanation is real and partially correct. Speculative capital did drive significant rail investment, but the schools were not speculative investments. They were public institutions, funded through municipal taxation, built by governments that, in theory, were accountable to existing populations. The civic pride argument implies responsive construction. A community grows, it needs a school, it builds one. What the record actually shows repeatedly is the opposite sequence. The school appears, the community fills in around it. Building, designed for hundreds, sits partially occupied for years before the neighborhood density justifies its scale. Infrastructure before demand, in the canals, in the rails, in the schools. Whether this reflects a coordinated inheritance or an extraordinary convergence of independent decisions made by separate actors across a continent is a question the evidence alone cannot settle. Move now to the United Kingdom, because the pattern does not stop at the Atlantic. Between 1870 and 1890, following the passage of the Education Act of 1870, Britain undertook one of the most ambitious public building programs in its history. School boards were established across England and Wales. Buildings went up at a pace that astonished contemporary commentators. The London School Board alone constructed over 400 school buildings in roughly 2 decades, formal multi-story structures of brick and stone, designed with the same over-engineered solidity that characterized their American counterparts. The architectural language was different. Gothic Revival influences London stop brick rather than American limestone. But the structural logic was identical. Walls thicker than load requirements demanded. Foundation work deeper than the building's height necessitated. Interior volumes, ceiling heights, corridor widths, stairwell dimensions, size for flows of people that the surrounding neighborhoods would not generate for years. The London School Board's own records, preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, contain correspondence from board members puzzling over construction costs that seemed to exceed functional necessity. Engineers hired to review plans occasionally pushed back on specifications they found difficult to justify on purely practical grounds. The board, in nearly every documented case, approved the original specifications anyway. Somebody knew something about what these buildings needed to be. The administrative similarity is worth dwelling on. When you place American School Board documentation from the 1860s alongside British School Board documentation from the 1870s, the structural parallels go beyond the buildings themselves. The organizational frameworks are nearly identical. Criteria for site selection follow the same logic: prominent corner lots, elevated ground where available, proximity to main transit corridors rather than residential centers. The bidding processes, the construction oversight protocols, the maintenance standards encoded in early regulations, these read across an ocean and a decade of separation, though drawn from the same original source. Educational historians attribute this to the well-documented exchange of ideas between American and British reform movements. Horace Mann traveled to Europe. British reformers read American reports. Delegation visits moved in both directions. The intellectual cross-pollination was real and significant. But intellectual cross-pollination produces adapted ideas, produces variation shaped by local context, local politics, local materials. What the administrative records of American and British school systems show is something closer to template adoption. The same framework, the same criteria, the same structural tolerances, reproduced across jurisdictions that had every political and geographical reason to diverge. The compounding weight of this evidence is difficult to describe without it sounding like more than it is. These are not hidden documents. They are not suppressed records recovered from sealed archives. Canal histories are in standard textbooks. The rail expansion data is well catalogued. The school board records are publicly accessible in the cities where they were kept. Pattern was always there, sitting inside the official record, waiting for someone to read across disciplines rather than within them. One more dimension brings the scale into sharpest focus. The storage systems built alongside the schools and the rails and the canals, the granaries, the municipal warehouses, the underground cisterns in city after city were built to capacities that, at the time of construction had no corresponding population to fill them. Chicago's grain storage infrastructure in the 1850s was sized for a city, 3 times its actual population. New York's municipal reservoir system, completed in the 1840s, served a city of 300,000, with infrastructure designed by its own engineering specifications for over 1 million. The city caught up. It always did. But the infrastructure was already there, waiting as though whoever built it knew, with considerable confidence, what was coming. Framework is starting to take shape. Not a conspiracy. Not a secret. Something more structural than either of those words implies. And it carries a name, a label that has accumulated, over time, both serious academic meaning and considerable popular distortion. That label is where the final layer of this story begins. The word Tartaria appears in European cartography as early as the 13th century. It was not invented by the internet. It was not coined by a conspiracy theorist in a basement. It appears in the maps of Gerardus Mercator, the geographer whose projection system still shapes how we visualize the globe. It appears in the writings of Marco Polo, in the diplomatic correspondence of medieval papal envoys, in the geographical encyclopedias of 16th century scholars who used it to describe, with varying degrees of precision, vast interior territories of Eurasia, the steppes, the Khanate, the enormous swath of land stretching from the Caspian to the Pacific that no single European power had fully mapped or governed. For centuries, Tartaria was simply a geographical term, imprecise by modern standards, contested even then, but legitimate, a placeholder name for an enormous and incompletely understood region of the world. What happened to that term over the following centuries is a story about how knowledge gets simplified, how complexity gets flattened, and how the gaps left by that flattening eventually get filled. Sometimes by scholarship, sometimes by imagination, sometimes by something in between. By the 19th century, as European imperial mapping projects became more systematic, the term Tartaria began to recede from formal cartography. The territories it had once vaguely described were being claimed, named, subdivided, and administered by the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty, the British colonial apparatus in Central Asia. Precision replaced the placeholder. Tartaria, as a cartographic category, was retired, not erased, not suppressed, simply superseded by more granular naming. In academic geography, this is entirely unremarkable. Terminology evolves with knowledge. The medieval term Cathay gave way to China. Hindustan was formalized into a patchwork of colonial administrative districts. Tartaria followed the same arc. What is more interesting is what the modern reinterpretation of Tartaria has done with this historical reality. Beginning roughly in the 2010s, a body of online content initially scattered across forums, then consolidated into YouTube channels, then elaborated into something approaching a full alternative historical framework, began using the term Tartaria to describe something quite different from a geographical placeholder. In this reinterpretation, Tartaria becomes the name for a proposed lost civilization, technologically sophisticated, architecturally prolific, globally distributed, and deliberately removed from the official historical record sometime in the 18th or 19th century. The monumental buildings, the schools, the courthouses, the train stations, the civic structures that seem overbuilt for their supposed moment become, in this framework, the physical remnants of that civilization, not built by the 19th century, inherited by it. There are 3 distinct ways serious thinkers have engaged with the material this framework raises, and they are worth presenting plainly because none of them is without merit, and none of them is without problem. The first is the conventional historical interpretation. The over-engineered schools, the infrastructure before demand pattern, the administrative similarities across continents, all of these are explicable, this view holds, through documented mechanisms. The spread of Enlightenment civic idealism, the ambitions of speculative capital, the cross-pollination of reform movements, and the well-understood tendency of institutional builders to plan for futures rather than presents. The monumental scale reflects aspiration, not inheritance. The pattern reflects convergence, not coordination. This interpretation has the weight of mainstream scholarship behind it. It is coherent. It accounts for most of the evidence. What it does not account for comfortably is the mechanical anomalies, the ventilation shafts, the heating infrastructure, the foundation tolerances that appear to predate their official introduction dates. Conventional history handles these as documentation failures, which is a legitimate explanation. It is also, at scale, a somewhat convenient one. The second interpretation is architectural archaeology, a serious academic subfield that takes the physical evidence of buildings as primary texts, independent of written records. Practitioners in this field have occasionally noted, without ideological investment in any alternative history, that certain 19th century public buildings contain structural features inconsistent with their documented construction dates. They attribute this to phased construction, undocumented renovation, and the general unreliability of municipal records in the pre-standardization era. This is a careful, defensible reading. It leaves the anomalies in place as genuine puzzles while declining to draw large conclusions from them. The third interpretation is the Tartaria framework itself. In its more thoughtful articulations, stripped of the conspiratorial language that dominates its popular presentation. In this reading, the monumental civic infrastructure of the 19th century was not built from scratch by the societies that claimed it. It was received from a prior organizational structure, a prior administrative system, a prior civilization that was either dismantled, collapsed, or simply rebranded as the new national and imperial orders consolidated their authority. The schools, on this reading, were not built for the children of 1855. They were repurposed for them. This interpretation has the advantage of explaining the infrastructure before demand pattern most directly to its struggles with the question of evidence. A prior civilization of this scale would leave traces that the archaeological record, as currently understood, does not support in the form this framework requires. Return now to 1816. That year is sometimes called the year without a summer. The eruption of Mount Tambora in the Dutch East Indies the previous April had thrown enough particulate matter into the upper atmosphere to measurably reduce global temperatures. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Famine conditions emerged in regions that had been stable for generations. Entire communities displaced. Migration patterns shifted. What followed, in the decades immediately after, was an extraordinary burst of institutional construction. The canals, the schools, the rail networks, the civic buildings that now sit at the center of this investigation. It is one of the great rebuilding moments in recorded Western history. The question the Tartaria framework quietly forces into view is not whether this rebuilding happened. It clearly did. The question is whether the builders were starting from nothing, or whether they were working from a template they had inherited, partially understood, and were trying to reconstruct. That is not a question with a clean answer. It is, however, a question that the architectural record, the ventilation shafts, the foundation tolerances, the over-engineered walls of a school built for 200 children refuses to let go of entirely. The metaphor that sits most honestly at the center of all of this is not a conspiracy. It is not a revelation. It is something more like a palimpsest, a manuscript page that has been scraped and rewritten, where the original text is mostly gone, but not entirely, where the pressure of older ink occasionally shows through the newer surface if you hold it at the right angle in the right light. The 19th century may have been, in some ways we do not yet have full language for, a rewriting over something older. The schools, the canals, the rails, the civic systems, they may carry within their stone and their subfloor channels the faint impression of a prior script. Or they may be exactly what the official record says, the ambitious, sometimes overreaching, genuinely remarkable construction of a civilization building itself in real time. The evidence invites examination. The buildings are still standing. Whatever they were built for, and whenever they were truly built, they have lasted longer than the explanations offered for them. And that, perhaps, is the most honest place to stop.